Okay, well, so we're here with Tyler Sookralli. Is that how you say your name?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. And you wrote The Devil Wears Skin, published in Apparition Literary Magazine that I enjoyed reading a few days ago. And I just wanted to ask you, what kind of was the inspiration originally for that story? What made you come up with that?
So I was responding to a magazine's prompt regarding food. So that month's theme was rice. So naturally, I guess in all things we do, we like examine different parts of the world in relation to what we know or we're familiar with. So when I saw rice, I thought of growing up, and rice is a big culinary aspect of Indo-Caribbean food as a whole. And also it has to do with this idea of the sukian, or a mythical creature in Caribbean folklore. So naturally, I guess when I saw rice, I thought of that. And so then I decided to respond in a way that would incorporate that.
And so when I originally had heard, I hadn't heard of the Sukyan actually. I don't think so. When I looked it up, it kind of I'd originally kind of thought, oh, succubus or something like that. But
Right.
what is that exactly? The Sukyan?
Yeah, so honestly, it might actually be related to a succubus, or like, the root might be, 'cause it's the same idea of like a figure that seems to be draining the life of another to feed itself. But I think in the Caribbean, it's actually interesting because it derives from the racial division between the different populations. So particularly in Trinidad, for example, they have the Indo-Caribbean populations, the Afro-Caribbean populations, the Chinese Caribbean populations. And oftentimes, these different communities are at odds with one another. And so, from what I've heard growing up, is that these different communities would often call each other Sukyans, or be like, don't go next to this group of people because they, can have these creatures amongst them. So it's actually interesting to kind of see how these creatures of like mythical folklore are used to drive division in the Caribbean.
Is there any like syncretism of the folkloric elements between like because you have all these different populations living together,
Right, right.
even if you have division there, like there's got to be some blending of mythological creatures and stories, right? Or
Yes, definitely. So I think the Sukiyant originally derives from, I would think, African folklore, and then that transitioned into the Indo-Caribbean population, utilizing it in a way almost against the Afro-Caribbean population. So yeah, there's definitely blending, but interestingly, they kind of use that blending to then target one another, and I think that's something that we still kind of see in the Caribbean for whatever reason that is, just continual division or attempts to drive division.
And so, what is your, I guess, background growing up? Did that play into the story a good bit?
Yes, so I'm Indo-Caribbean, and I was lucky enough to visit Trinidad, so I saw some of these aspects myself of, these populations sticking to themselves and choosing to not really interact with each other as much as they maybe could, or derogatory terms being turned around, things like that.
And so, if I could ask you a little bit about the writing style of it,
Yes.
there were a couple times. I'll just read a couple of sentences or pieces from your story. So, sadly, trees can't talk and therefore can't scream and therefore couldn't help and therefore my sister's dead was one of them. So there's that repetition of therefore, therefore, therefore. And then there
Yeah.
was one, I ran before I screamed, before I wept, before I whispered a wordless prayer. So it was kind of this repetition of thing. And what was the age of the protagonist in this story in your imagination?
For me, maybe like a 7, 8-year-old. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's framed as almost somebody looking back in the past, right? But I think like when this event occurred, maybe 7, 8 in my head.
Okay, I thought maybe it had to do with the age a little bit, but what kind of made you think of doing that kind of a repetition in those sentences?
It's interestingly, like I said, it was the prompt that kind of inspired me to write the piece. So with that, I believe the limit was, I think, 1,000 words. So I think working within those confines of like the word count, maybe that almost influenced my idea of time in relation to this piece. So I think those moments where you see therefore and the ands, it's me almost working with pacing to get the story out, to work within those confines. And I kind of kept it in because I think it does bring an interesting syncopation in the end. But I'd say more than anything, it's probably like a stream of consciousness when I was first writing to really get those ideas down. And therefore, it's kind of just, like getting to the next point quickly without having to like leave space for that flowery business. But I think in the end, it makes the piece a bit unique as well.
one aspect I really liked was a lot of short stories tend to have the like a story play out and then the reveal or like the horrifying aspect is like at the end. But in the very beginning, you have the Sukuyan or whatever knows you're there, and it know like immediately the horror element is just writing it like spikes into the audience, and I really liked that.
Yeah.
Because the I don't have as much experience reading short stories as my buddy does, but like
Yes.
that is an element. Like, is that something you thought about and when you were creating it?
Yeah, so honestly, again, it goes back to kind of the idea of this prompt, right? And I wanted to get the piece selected or chosen. So I guess I figured the best way to do that is with, as we're kind of taught in elementary school, like a hook or like a grabber, but translating that to fiction and really like a profound image that would stick with whoever's reading this to select the work. I think it comes down ultimately to that. And again, especially with like such limited word count. I kind of wanted to make sure that beginning image was really profound. So I think that was kind of why I began with that.
And what future things are you thinking on writing about? Are you thinking of writing on similar topics in the future, horror kinds of elements, or what are you thinking of focusing on?
Yeah, definitely. So I typically write within the genres of horror, fantasy, science fiction. So anything speculative, I guess you can say. And I plan to expand on those as well. And I do like to draw from Indo-Caribbean heritage and folklore mythology because I think it's oftentimes, I guess, Caribbean folklore mythology as a whole is oftentimes misrepresented or just not represented at all in mainstream media or things like that. So it'd be nice to kind of see that pushed forward a little bit, and also to have these conversations about like what do these figures represent in the Caribbean, and as I brought up before, the social division it could represent. The effects of colonialism it could represent, like really unraveling those different aspects by first bringing these mythical, scary creatures to the forefront, which would then allow us to analyze them further.
And do you have major inspirations as far as like the people that you read, certain authors or certain books?
Yeah, so I suppose he's a bit older now. I think he passed away, but in the 1960s, that this was his peak. There was an author named V.S. Naipaul from Trinidad. He didn't write in the genres of horror or fantasy per se, mostly literary fiction, but he was actually a Nobel Literature Prize winner, and I think coming from a small island from Trinidad, that says a lot. That his literature must mean something, and I really like the characters that they represent, and he kind of more directly poses some of these questions about social division, colonialism, and I kind of want to adapt that into a more speculative space, if that makes sense.
Well, great, thanks. So that's yeah, really interesting. Those are all the questions that I thought of. I don't know, Cody, did you want to mention anything else? Your mic's off, Cody.
Yeah, one thing I noticed is the the sort of home, this place that is kind of like a second home to the characters is dilapidated, is sort of falling apart in disrepair before you even get to the house.
Right.
And that's like an element where like you were sort of constrained by the word limit. But the I love that, and I want to know, like, is that something you were thinking of directly, like making the sort of feeling of this home is not going to be as familiar as you expect when you
Yeah.
get there. Because like the monster, and the other question I had, like a sort of addendum to that, is
Hmm.
rice a part of the mythical creatures like mythology, or is that like your own creation, like the rice counting?
Yeah, yeah. So responding to the latter half first, yes, the rice is a part of that traditional story where, according to legend, if you place the rice down, this Sukunyan is forced to then count the rice grains, and that's how you can like banish it away from the house. So yes, that was completely from folklore, and then I incorporated that into this larger story. Responding to the idea of like the degradation of the houses and the things like that, that draws from two aspects. Firstly, it's something that I saw myself in Trinidad that this despite it being a relatively wealthy Caribbean country, there was still a lot of issues that comes from colonialism and previous problems and trickles down where they still have a lot of development to do. And I think also it just touches more on this idea of visiting home or revisiting home because as a college student myself, like going back home after that first time that you leave, it's not exactly the same, and I guess it never would be the same. Even leaving campus to study abroad per se as I did. And then when you go back to campus, it's not the same. So I think it's kind of just touching on the idea of what we view in life and the experiences we have. It really alters the way that we see things, because then when you revisit a space that you may have been familiar with at one point, it may not be exactly the same as you remember it in one way or the other. So I think that was something that maybe I was kind of tackling in my own life, and that kind of manifested in the work.
Right, thanks. Well, that's it from me, and I think those are the questions Cody had too. So thanks so much. I know it's short, but I'm thinking of always keeping these probably between 10, 20 minutes anyway. But
Yeah.
I think it's we'll link to the story in the description, and hopefully people will check it out. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you. This is
Yeah.
great.